Hey everybody, we're just chugging along to chapter 21. We cover here the imperfect tense, the active and middle passive voice. Just a couple key terms, imperfect tense and a little something called an augment. Let's talk for a second about the past tense in English. The English has more than one kind of past tense. We have a past completed in the active voice. I studied. In the passive, the past completed would be I was studied. We can also form the past as a continuous, that is a past time action with continuous aspect. In the active, this would be I was studying. Studying as a process, not studying as a simple event. And then the past continuous in the passive, I was being studied. The Greek, like English, has more than one kind of past tense. We're looking in this chapter at something called the imperfect tense. This tense describes a continuous action occurring in the past. So when you think imperfect, don't think it's not ideal. Think it's not perfected or not completed. So even though it happens in the past, the action goes on for some time in the past. It is uncompleted. In a subsequent chapter, we'll talk about the aorist tense, not pronounced aorist, but aorist. This describes a completed or an undefined action occurring in the past. So both tenses are past tense. They each have a different aspect. The imperfect has continuous aspect. The aorist has completed, also called undefined aspect. Let's summarize then the different ways to translate the Greek tenses. A Greek present tense will be translated using the helping verb is, am, or are in English. So I am, you are, he is. A Greek future will translate using the helping verb will. A Greek imperfect will translate using the helping verb was or were. I was, you were. And then as we'll see later, the aorist tense is translated as a simple past, therefore using the ed suffix, or in the case of irregular verbs, the irregular past form. Okay, just to illustrate the difference between the imperfect and the aorist. Notice the imperfect, agapone, I was loving. So loving that happened in the past, but that happened as a process over a period of time. Now how long we don't know, but it was a period of time. So that's the imperfect continuous aspect. Another example, elegan, I was saying. So not just that someone simply spoke, but that they were speaking over a period of time. The aorist tense is simply a past event completed, saying nothing else about how long the action occurred. Agapisa, I loved. Apon, I said. We don't know how long the loving or the speaking occurred. We just know that it occurred in the past. Okay, so to form the imperfect indicative in Greek, you've been taught so far that verbs have 3 or 4 parts. A stem, a connecting vowel, a personal ending. This chapter we add something called the augment. The augment will usually appear as an epsilon preceding the prefix. It's called an augment because it's simply a lengthener, sort of a verb augmentation procedure. So with the active imperfect, we use a new set of endings, the secondary active set of personal endings. Now the third set of personal endings you've learned. And I'll show you those in a moment. In forming the imperfect, middle, and passive, formation is the same. You use an augment, you use a stem, you use a connecting vowel, and you use secondary personal endings, but now the secondary, middle, passive personal endings, the fourth set of personal endings, and the final set of personal endings you'll need to learn. Let's zoom in for a minute on the augment. The augment, as I said, usually appears as an epsilon added to the beginning of the word. So luo becomes eluon. Echo presents a special situation because when the epsilon is added, we now have epsilon epsilon, which will contract to epsilon iota. When a verb begins with a vowel or a diphthong, usually we will lengthen the vowel. Agapao becomes agapone. And that eta is actually an augmentation. In other situations, we'll lengthen the first vowel or leave the first vowel unchanged, like when we have the diphthong u. Eucharistou becomes a Eucharistun. And with iro, the alpha will lengthen to eta, and now the iota will subscript. When we have a compound verb, that is a verb consisting of a prepositional prefix plus the simplex form of the verb, we will add an epsilon not to the beginning, not prior to the prepositional prefix, but between the prefix and the simple verb. Katabino becomes not ekatabinon, but katebainon. In ekbalo, notice the ek will change to x in order to accommodate that vowel between exebalon. And in rare situations, the vowel at the beginning of the prepositional prefix does augment, as if speakers conceived of the initial prefix as in fact an essential part of the verb and not a prefix at all. So much for the augment. What stem are we using? You recall that Greek verbs have principal parts. There are 6 for those verbs that have all of them. Luo is used for the present active indicative, and that luo is the first person singular form. The second principal part is the future. Where then does the imperfect come in? The imperfect actually is based off of the first principal part. That's why Mount's lists and the vocabulary lists a form in parentheses just after the first principal part. That does not count as the second principal part. It counts as the imperfect form based on the first principal part. So you see here the future active indicative first singular constitutes the second principal part. And now here we have the imperfect form in parentheses showing that it's based off of the first principal part. The rule for the connecting vowel is exactly the same as before. Omicron before a mu or nu. So think, are you going to study tonight? I'm on it. An omicron before a mu or a nu. Epsilon before everything else. Easy. For the personal endings, you've learned the primary active set of personal endings, the primary, middle, and passive set of personal endings. My, sai, tai, methostat, and tai. With the imperfect, we now introduce the secondary personal endings. The secondary active, nu, sigma, and then we have a movable nu in the third singular, min, ta, or nu, and an alternate form san that appears sometimes. In the secondary middle passive personal endings, main, sa, ta, methostat, nta. Main, sa, ta, methostat, nta. So very similar to the primary middle passive personal endings, but not identical. So here are the complete conjugations. The imperfect active indicative of luo, eluon, elus, eluin, eluamen, eluita, eluon. Again, I think it's helpful if you think of the word as consisting of parts. You've got your stem lu, which we got from the first principal part. We added our augment, and then we add our secondary active personal endings separated by connecting vowel. The imperfect middle passive indicative of luo, we use exactly the same stem, lu, and then we add our augment. But now instead of using the secondary active personal endings, we use the secondary middle passive personal endings. What, though, has happened in the second person? Why do we have omicron upsilon? The endings ought to be main sata, methostat, nta. Main sata. Why then do we have u? Well, again, we have that intervocalic sigma. When the sa was added, we then had a sa wedged between an epsilon and an omicron, and they smothered that sigma to death. and there's skirmish for its attention. And the sigma, now having vacated the epsilon and the omicron, by rule contract to omicron upsilon. Introduced in this chapter also is the imperfect active indicative of ame. If you remember, ame means I am. In the imperfect tense, it would mean I was. So amein, I was. Ace, you were. Ain, he was. Amen, we were. Eta, you all were. Ason, they were. So again, this is a somewhat irregular verb, but you can see the resemblance of the personal endings that you just learned. Okay, so continue memorizing the master verb chart. And here's a certain strong man filling the master verb chart with its power, and he will fill you too. So here's the augment column. So far, only the imperfect active and imperfect middle passive use an augment. This tells you which tense stem to use, what the tense formative is, how to find the connecting vowel, which set of personal endings to use. A nice tool, and beautifully put together, I might add. Let's read over the vocabulary, making sure we put our accents in the right place. Akalutheo, didasko, eperotao, erotao, dullo, peripateo, sunagoge, pharisaios, chronos. Closing in on 75% of the words in the New Testament. Not bad. Now, I've got good news for everybody here. If you love Greek, you're thinking, I just finished chapter 21, but I got to do another one. I got to go on to chapter 22. This is great. If you're not feeling this way, I've got good news as well. You just have one more. There is only one more. We've completed 21 chapters. 22 chapters, our final chapter, will round out the course. And then there's Greek too. Hope to see you there.